may think that we make personal life choices as individuals, as if the individual more or less existed in isolation. But the reality is that we do not so exist. We human beings are social creatures, and virtually all of our choices are made under the influence and in the context of the various organizations in which we participate. By organizations, I do not mean simply business organizations. Families are organizations, and many of the principles that hold true for families also hold true for businesses, and vice versa. On the largest scale, our whole society is an organization. On the smallest, every single social relationship we have is an organization. If the decisions we make affected only ourselves, we could simply do whatever we want to do, take responsibility for it, and deal with the consequences of our actions. But when others are involved, this brings us very clearly into the realm of ethics and the matter of civility. All that is generally meant these days by civility is mere superficial politeness. But the fact of the matter is that people have been politely stabbing each other in the back and politely hurting each other for God knows how long. I was helped to arrive at a more meaningful definition of civility by an Englishman of the last century, Oliver Hereford, who is famed for saying, "A gentleman is someone who never hurts another person's feelings unintentionally." What that meant to me is that sometimes it may be necessary to hurt another person's feelings, but the key element is that of intention, meaning to be aware of what you are doing. Such awareness requires consciousness. So in my book on the subject, A World Waiting to be Born, I define civility not as mere superficial politeness, but as consciously motivated, organizational behavior that is ethical in submission to a higher power. It can be assumed that anyone who has made the choice to be conscious wants to be a civil person. But there is a major problem here. In order to be civil, we must not only be conscious of our own motivations, but also conscious of the organization or system in which we are acting. Civility requires organizational as well as individual consciousness. Consequently, if we aspire to ever greater civility, we must increasingly think in terms of systems. The most enjoyable part of my medical school education was the study of microscopic anatomy. All external appearances to the contrary, our bodies are mostly water. Consequently, when you look at thin slices of our organs under a microscope, you cannot see much except pallid, indistinguishable filaments. But if you take these same slices, soak them for a while in selected dyes, and look again, suddenly you have entered a fairyland, a garden of delights compared to which Disneyland is downright insipid. No matter what our age, station, or even state of health, at this level, we are all very beautiful on the inside. Gradually, as I peered at one beautiful cell after another, something dawned on me. Each and every cell was not only a system in itself, but also a minuscule part of a larger, even more complex system. The absorbing villi cells, the smooth muscle cells, and the connective tissue cells holding them together were all an integrated part of an organ, in this case the small intestine. The small intestine, in turn, was part of the digestive system, and the digestive system was integrated with other systems of the body. Then I realized that since each individual cell was a component of an organ, and each individual organ a component of a body system, and each such system a component of the body as a whole, was it not possible that my body was also part of a larger system? In other words, might I, my individual self, be but a single cell of an organ of some gigantic organism, Of course. As a fledgling physician, I was connected, directly or indirectly, to countless other individual human cells. To my parents who paid my tuition, to the older physicians who taught me, to the laboratory technicians who conducted the tests I ordered, to hospital administrators, to manufacturers who made the equipment I used, to the patients I used that equipment on, to growers in Mississippi and California who sold cotton to the North Carolina textile workers who made the clothes I wore, to ranchers in Kansas who grew the beef and farmers in New Jersey who grew the lettuce I ate, to the truck drivers who transported all these things to me, to my landlord, to the barber who cut my hair, and on and on. So it was, although I had not yet even heard the term, that I became a foursquare believer in systems theory. The basic tenet of systems theory, which is actually not a theory but a fact, is that everything is a system. Our Earth is, of course, a part of the solar system, and as we begin to reach even further out into space, we will probably perceive a systemic nature to the galaxies and the universe itself. Beyond the fact that everything that exists is part of a system, systems theory also holds that if you change one component of the system, all the other parts must also change. But even with a relatively advanced degree of consciousness, most of us remain remarkably unconscious of the complex organizations and social systems to which we belong. The fact is, there is no way that we can evolve into a more civil society until ever greater numbers of us are willing to make the choice not only for personal consciousness, but also to think in terms of whole systems. I have a friend who was one of the first American pilots shot down and captured by the North Vietnamese. In the early days of his 7-year captivity, he and his fellow prisoners of war were systematically tortured. In an extraordinary book about his experiences, he made it quite clear that his captors were engaging in fully conscious organizational behavior. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew that anyone will break under enough pain and that their torture would extract confessions, no matter how false, useful for propaganda purposes and serving their organizational mission. Even those who were horrified by the incivility of America's prosecution of the Vietnam War would never consider torture to have been a civil response or in any way justified. So civility is something more than organizational behavior that is merely consciously motivated. It must be ethical as well. In dealing with the ethical complexities that confront individuals and organizations, I have found the distinction between code ethics and situation ethics to be helpful, almost essential. Code ethics are derived from various ethical prescriptions that have been in use throughout history. The earliest known is the Code of Hammurabi. Far better known to us are the Ten Commandments. What such codes do is to pronounce certain acts to be bad, wrong, or unpermissible under any circumstances. For instance, one of the Ten Commandments states, "Thou shalt not kill." It doesn't say, "Thou shalt not kill except in time of war," or "Thou shalt not kill except in self-defense." It says, "Thou shalt not kill, period. No ifs, ands, or buts." The basic tenet of situation ethics, however, is that no ethical judgment can be made about any act without consideration of the circumstances under which it occurs. Unlike the Ten Commandments, situation ethics would allow for killing in such circumstances as wartime and self-defense. I heartily support the movement of society and of individuals in their own personal decision-making toward situational ethics. As a psychiatrist, I am very familiar with the fact that rigid code ethics often have inhumane consequences. But there are two caveats to be considered. One is that the use of situation ethics means that there are no formulas, and healthy individuals have the responsibility to reconsider their behavior each time the situation changes ever so slightly. My other caveat is that I do not want to imply that code ethics are useless. For instance, I'm not sure we would even attempt to discriminate between just and unjust wars were it not for the existence of a persisting code ethic that states, "Thou shalt not kill." There are several important ways of looking at the relationship between individuals and organizations. One is to recognize the difference between dependence and collaboration. In The Road Less Traveled, I noted that we all have dependency needs and feelings, but these do not constitute love, and that to be driven by them is to fall into the terrible trap of dependency. It is a trap because it leaves the dependent individual with a continual feeling that he cannot be whole or happy without the almost constant attention of other people. At the time I wrote The Road Less Traveled, I myself was still operating to some degree under the ethic of good old American rugged individualism. And, as I mentioned earlier, the problem with the ethic of rugged individualism is that it neglects the other side of the coin. In The Different Drum, written 7 years later, I denounced this simplistic, one-sided, non-paradoxical, and therefore fallacious ethic, and in talking about community, began to champion interdependence. My most dramatic examples of the virtues of interdependence have come from my work in helping groups build community. But let me also sing its praises in the smallest of organizations, marriage. Over the years, Lily and I have come to appreciate each other's very different styles as gifts and have slowly begun to incorporate the other's gifts into ourselves. As a consequence, she and I are gradually becoming more whole as individuals. But this would not have been possible had we not first come to terms with our individual limitations and recognized the value of our interdependence. The only problem with the word interdependence is that it may suggest to some codependency. A fashionable word this past decade, codependency refers to a relationship in which the partners cater to and thereby encourage each other's weaknesses. So it may be helpful to think of interdependence in terms of another word, collaboration, laboring together. When collaboration is poor in an organization, the system can look quite ugly. But when the collaboration is good, not only is the organization efficient, but its system can be so beautiful to behold that it approaches a kind of mystical glory. Interdependence does not necessarily mean that the collaborating individuals have different roles. Usually, however, it does. And whenever there are different roles in an organization, two important factors immediately come into play: accountability and structure. In our marriage, I am able to depend upon Lily for most of the homemaking because she not only does it, but does it well. And she can depend upon me for the money-making for the same reason. We play these roles well because we consider ourselves responsible for doing so. In other words, we hold ourselves and each other accountable. On the negative side, accountability implies that someone is subject to being judged. On the positive side, it implies that the accountable person is trusted. Were Lily to significantly fail to perform her homemaking role, were she no longer accountable, I could no longer trust her to fulfill that role and would have to step in and take over. Such a takeover would be natural and simple if her loss of accountability was due to a temporary physical illness. For instance, when she had a breast abscess following the birth of our third child, it was the most natural thing in the world for me to take over the care of that infant and our 2 other young children. Had that not been a temporary condition, however, it would have meant a major restructuring of our marriage. So differing roles and accountabilities imply structure. Within a small, but not necessarily simple, organization like marriage, the roles and structure may be relatively informal. But the larger and more complex the organization becomes, the more it is essential that the accountability structure be formalized. Whenever there is accountability structured into a system, be it as small as a marriage or as large as a corporation, there is also an authority structure. This doesn't mean that authority can't be shared. For instance, the money Lily and I save is split equally between us. Any important decision about the children and about major investments or expenses we have always made conjointly. Nonetheless, as individuals, we each have limited authority within our own domains. Our marriage is in no way hierarchical. Although there is a system of accountability, neither of us is the overall boss. But there is no way in larger systems, such as businesses, that you can have a structure of accountability without a chain of command. What that chain of command will look like can vary considerably, but somewhere the buck has to stop. Because they have had unpleasant experiences with hierarchical authority systems, there is a tendency on the part of many people to distrust all structure. They need to guard against such a tendency. There can be highly dysfunctional structures, but structure is by no means all bad. Most of it is good. Indeed, over the years I have come to learn that not only children, but adults very much need structure. Although people often don't realize it, structures can be flexible. A significant part of the work at FCE is to teach organizations, both large and small, how to operate in community. When operating in a community mode, the group does not have a rigid authority structure. Authority and leadership are shared, as they must be, to maximize communication. But we could not do this work if it meant that organizations had to abandon their hierarchical authority structure altogether. We can do it only because it is possible for an organization to operate in a hierarchical mode while dealing with its day-to-day operations. But it can switch to a community mode in response to certain issues and problems, like those of diversity and morale and situations when group decision-making is required. As I noted in The Road Less Traveled, one of the characteristics of individual mental health is what I call flexible response systems. This is also a characteristic of organizational health. An organization that has 2 modes of operating at its command and can use one or the other contingent upon the circumstances is obviously going to be a healthier organization than one that can only function in a single way. Wherever a structure of accountability and differing roles has been established, there you will find boundaries. Every human being has to deal with boundary issues within the organization of his or her marriage, nuclear family, extended family, network of friendship, and employment. Each of us as individuals must make choices day in and day out, defining our boundaries within the framework of any organization. Perhaps the easier of such choices involves the degree to which you are going to respect other people's boundaries. These boundaries will vary from individual to individual and culture to culture. Psychologists, for instance, have discerned that within any culture there is actually a specific spatial distance within which most people feel comfortable communicating with their fellows. In the United States, that distance is relatively large, and seldom do we talk with a new acquaintance unless our faces are a good 3 feet distant from each other. In India, on the other hand, the norm may be more like 1 foot. When we speak about giving each other space, however, we mean something much more complex than mere footage. Perhaps the most agonizing decisions we ever have to make are when to intervene in the affairs of our children, friends, or as we get older, in the lives of our parents. In my experience, a greater problem than learning an awareness of another's boundaries and when and how to respect them is the problem of choosing and setting our own boundaries. When I was still in the practice of psychotherapy, it seemed to me that at least half of my patients had what I came to call drawbridge problems. Sooner or later, I would say to them, all of us live in a castle. Around the castle, there is a moat, and over the moat, there is a drawbridge, which we can lower open or raise shut, depending upon our will. The problem was that their drawbridges did not work very well. Either they were laid open all the time, so that virtually anyone and everyone could amble into their personal space, prowl around, stay as long as they liked, and do whatever harm they would. Or else their drawbridges were raised shut and stuck, so that nobody or no thing could penetrate their isolated solitude. Neither case was benign. It is our choice when to lower our drawbridges and when to raise them, but this choice leads us into yet another complexity. Insofar as we may keep our drawbridges open, people or issues may come into our lives and hurt us, not so much physically as emotionally. The response of many to this dilemma is to keep their physical drawbridges somewhat open, but keep their emotional drawbridges firmly closed. It is as if an executive has an open door policy, but nobody who comes in through that door ever affects him. One of our ongoing problems in life is to continually choose the degree to which we are going to allow ourselves to be emotionally affected by issues and other people. It is the dilemma of vulnerability. The word vulnerability means the ability to be wounded. In choosing how vulnerable we are going to be as human beings, it is essential that we make the distinction between wounding as in being hurt and wounding as in being damaged. Under almost all circumstances, it would be plain stupid to walk into a situation where you are likely to be permanently damaged. But it might be very smart to open yourself up to situations, within limits, where you would be likely to experience some emotional pain, such as in taking a risk to enter a relationship that has the potential to lead to commitment. I am not advising anyone to be totally vulnerable, nor to be vulnerable at all times. Nonetheless, if you choose to be a healing presence in the world, it will be necessary to choose throughout your life to retain the capacity to be wounded to at least some degree. In a justifiably famous book entitled The Wounded Healer, Henri Nouwen writes that if we are to be effective healers, we must allow ourselves, within limits, to be continually wounded, and that indeed it is only out of our woundedness that we can heal or be healed. It has become very fashionable these days to use the term dysfunctional for organizations, whether they are businesses or families. Indeed, it is so fashionable that, like community and civility, the word dysfunctional is rapidly descending into meaninglessness. When I was still giving lectures, I used to ask my audiences upon occasion, "Will anyone here who was not brought up in a dysfunctional family please raise your hand?" Not a hand would be raised. All organizations are dysfunctional. But the point is that some are more dysfunctional than others. We have seen that one of the subtenets of systems theory is that whenever you change a part of the system, all the other parts have to change. However, systems inherently resist change. They resist healing. The plain fact of the matter is that most organizations, despite the blatancy of their dysfunctionality and its cost ineffectiveness, would rather remain dysfunctional than grow toward greater civility. Civility does not come naturally. It takes consciousness and action to achieve. Incivility comes more naturally, and due to laziness, it is simply easier to be uncivil. If that seems to be a pessimistic view, there is still room for optimism. It may be derived from my statement that all organizations are dysfunctional. What this means for you as heads of families and businesses is that you cannot do it perfectly, but you do the best you can anyway. To be as civil as possible in these complex and demanding roles is the path of smart selfishness, even though it requires a great deal of psycho-spiritual exertion. And as I suggested in A World Waiting to be Born, while incivility is easier, the creation of a relatively civil organization or culture is, in the long run, more cost-effective. It is also the route to creating something that is more healing and alive.